The dropships came down in the wheat at first light, and Ruth Kestrel had already been lying on the ridge for 6 hours. She felt the landing through the ground before she heard it, a pressure change under her ribs like a held breath finally let out, and she did not lift her head. The rifle lay along the berm in front of her, wrapped in a strip of burlap the color of dead grass, and her right hand was already curled loose around the grip the way her grandfather had taught her. No tension in the fingers, all of it in the shoulder and the breath. 400 meters below, the wheat that should have been half-grown by now lay flattened in 3 long ovals where the ships had set down, and shapes were already moving out of them, tall and gray and precise, spreading into the field the way water finds the low ground. Bell's Crossing sat behind her, 41 people last count, most of them still asleep, none of them armed with anything heavier than a fencing hatchet. The Larkspur Accord had seen to that 30 years ago, the treaty her grandfather still spat when he said it, the one that ended the war humanity had lost and took every rifle and cannon and warship away, except the ones nobody in the compact bothered to write down: heritage arms, non-military registry. A clause some tired human diplomat had begged for so families could keep what their great-grandparents carried off the colony ships, and which the other side had signed without reading twice, because who could possibly hurt them with an antique? Ruth's rifle was 111 years old. It had killed elk on this world, and 3 days before the ships came, it had killed a scarned scout in the tree line north of the reservoir, the first shot she had ever fired at anything that could think and be afraid, and she had not slept right since. Her mother had died the winter Ruth turned 9, a fever that the settlement's one antique medical scanner had flagged too late for the antibiotics on hand to matter, and her father had left for the mining concessions 2 systems over not long after, chasing a wage that might have kept the farm solvent, and instead, 3 years later, simply stopped sending word at all, not dead, so far as anyone could confirm. Just gone the particular way men sometimes went when grief and distance made it easier to disappear than to come home and face what was left of a family he no longer knew how to be part of. Silas had never once spoken ill of his son in front of either grandchild, not even the nights Ruth caught him staring too long at the old photograph on the mantel, and Ruth had decided, somewhere around her 13th year, that this particular silence was its own kind of lesson too, that some absences did not need explaining to still be carried, and some griefs were better folded quietly into the work of a day than argued over out loud. It was Silas, in the end, who had raised her and Tam both in every way that mattered, and it was Silas's rifle, and Silas's 13 years of cold mornings on the back 40, that had made her into whatever she was now, lying on the ridge in the dark, and she had never once resented either fact. 6 days ago the scout ship had crossed the sky at dusk, a thin silver line burning high and fast, and half of Bell's Crossing had come out into the street to watch it, and Ellen Hendricks had said, quiet, to no one in particular, that it was probably nothing, probably a survey pass. The compact ran those every few years and never once landed. Silas had not come out to watch. He had gone straight to the tool shed and pulled the rifle down from where it hung wrapped in oilcloth above the workbench, and by the time Ruth found him, he already had it broken down on a blanket, cleaning rod in hand, working the bore the way she had watched him do 100 times on quiet Sunday mornings that had never once felt urgent before that night. "You think it's them," she'd said. "I think a survey ship doesn't slow down over one valley for 40 minutes and then keep going," Silas had said, not looking up. "I fought in the last war, Ruthie. Not this rifle, a real one, standard issue, before the Accord made us hand every one of those in and melt them down in front of a compact inspector so the treaty would have something to point at. This is the only gun on this world they don't know we still have, because it was never a gun to them. It was a keepsake, a wall hanger. That's the only reason it's still in this shed." He had looked up at her then, and something in his face had made her understand, before he said another word, that everything about the next few days was going to be different than anything before it. If they land, and if they come for the crossing, I am not going to be able to stop them myself. My side's been bad for 2 years and it isn't getting better. You're going to have to be the one who remembers everything I taught you." Her grandfather Silas was in the root cellar under the house, now with a wound in his side that had stopped bleeding but not stopped hurting, taken 3 days ago in the tree line, when the scout ship's ground team had come looking for whatever had put a hole through their reconnaissance drone. And her brother Tam, 10 years old, was down there with him. And somewhere in the tall grass behind the Hendricks place, 3 scarred troopers in carapace plate were walking toward Ellen Hendricks' kitchen door like they had already decided nobody inside it mattered. Ruth breathed out half of what she'd taken in, the way Silas had drilled into her 1,000 times on the back 40, and settled the crosshair on the lead trooper's shoulder joint, where the plate seamed and the ward mesh generator sat like a coin under gray armor. She had 12 rounds left. 12, and no way to make more. The hand-loading bench in the shed had enough primers and powder for maybe 6 more rounds if she was careful, and Silas was in no shape to sit at it, and she had never done it herself past watching him. 12 rounds, and every one of them had to matter more than the last. She meant to make this one count. The report cracked flat across the field and rolled off into the tree line, and the lead trooper's shoulder joint blew outward in a spray of sparking plate, and the creature went down screaming in a register too high and wet to be anything human, and the other 2 scattered into the wheat like startled birds, weapons up, firing at nothing, at wind, at their own fear. 3 days ago, in the tree line, her hands had been shaking when she pulled the trigger on the scout, and the shot had gone through a shoulder instead of a throat, and the thing had lived long enough to put a bolt through Silas's side before it went down for good. This time, her hands did not shake. She was already moving before the echo died, rifle broken down against her chest, elbows and knees working her backward off the ridge crown into the gully where the old irrigation ditch ran dry, 20 meters left of where she'd fired, exactly the way Silas had taught her, never twice from the same stone, never twice from the same breath. Aboard the lead carrier, still climbing to station keep above the wheat, Fleet Commander Threa Vantiss watched the feed from the ground team's helmet cameras and did not, for several seconds, understand what she was looking at. "Say again," she said. "Generator failure, Commander." The voice belonged to squad leader Osix, flat with the particular calm the Scarn used when they did not yet know they should be afraid. Trooper Vell's ward mesh coupling failed under load. Structural fault, possibly manufacturing defect. We're pulling the unit for inspection. Trooper Vell is dead. A pause longer than it should have been. "Yes, Commander." A ward mesh coupling failing under load does not kill the wearer. It fails open. The mesh drops, nothing else happens. Vantiss leaned toward the display, close enough that her own reflection ghosted over the frozen frame of the wound, a hole through plate and meat both, entry small, exit not. "Get me a material scan on that armor before anyone touches it again." She had commanded the 9th Reclamation Flotilla for 11 years, had cleared 6 worlds under the Larkspur Accord's resource recovery clauses, without losing a soldier to anything but bad luck and worse terrain. And she did not like the particular quality of silence that came back to her from the ground team while they waited on the scan. She liked it less 40 minutes later, when a second trooper died on the edge of the settlement's grain silo. This one struck clean through the throat where the plate's collar seam sat thinnest, and no alarm on any sensor sang before it happened. "There's nothing on trace," Osix reported, and now the flat comm had cracked at its edges. "No heat bloom, no propellant signature, no discharge our instruments recognize as weapons fire at all. If I hadn't heard the report myself, I would tell you Trooper Karn simply fell down dead." Ruth lay in the ditch 200 meters from where she had fired, mud soaking through her jacket, and listened to the second shot's echo fade the same way she'd listened to the first, counting under her breath the way Silas had taught her when she was 7 years old and terrified of the recoil. 1, 2, 3. Don't move 4, 5, 6. They're still looking the wrong way. She had 10 rounds left now. She keyed the small radio clipped inside her collar, voice pitched barely above breath. Grandpa, 2 down, I'm moving to the second stand. The reply crackled thin and pained but steady. Second stand's good ground, but the light'll be behind you by noon. You'll throw a shadow past the rocks. Wait for the tree line to shade it or go to the third stand instead. Third stand's too far from the Hendricks place. Then wait for shade, Ruthie. A breath, wet and effortful on the other end. You're not in a hurry, they are. Every hour they don't know what's shooting them is an hour they're losing, not you. How's Tam? Scared and mad about it, which is the right way to be scared. He wants to know if you got another one. Tell him I got 2. He'll ask if you counted them right this time. Despite everything, something in her chest that had been wound tight since the ships came down loosened by half a turn. Tell him I counted them right. She waited for the shade. By mid-afternoon, Vantiss had grounded her own shuttle in the flattened wheat, against Ossix's clear discomfort, and stood over the second body herself with tactician Meyerth crouched beside her, running a scanner slowly along the wound track like the instrument might change its answer if asked patiently enough. Talk to me, Vantiss said. The wound geometry is consistent with a high-velocity solid projectile, Meyerth said. Not a flechette, not a rail slug, those would register on trace regardless of size. The electromagnetic signature is unavoidable. This has no signature at all. Chemically propelled. A combustion charge behind an inert metal mass. She looked up, and something in her long gray face that might have been the Scarn equivalent of disbelief moved across it. Commander, this is a museum weapon. This technology predates our first contact with this species by 1,000 years of our reckoning. Nobody has fielded a combustion slug-thrower in organized warfare since before the Compact Charter. And yet twice today it has put a hole through reclamation-grade carapace plate that our own arc rifles need 3 shots to match. Slower than sound, unguided, hand-aimed. It should not be able to do that. It is doing that, Vantiss said, and looked out across the gold field toward the dark line of trees a kilometer off, and felt, for the first time in 11 years of clearing worlds that never fought back, something close to unease settle behind her sternum. Pull everyone back to the ships until we understand what we're standing in. I want a full-spectrum sweep of that tree line, ground radar, everything we have. And someone tell me who taught these people to still know how to use a thing this old. That was the question that would not leave her, through the rest of that long gold afternoon, and into the night that followed, not what the weapon was, because Meyerth would answer that question soon enough with the flat certainty of someone reading it out of an archive nobody had opened in centuries, but who had kept the knowledge of it alive on a world the Compact's own records listed as disarmed. She got part of her answer near dusk, when a young trooper barely past his molt strayed too close to a fence line at the edge of the settlement, chasing what his suit told him was a heat signature moving in the grass. A stray dog, as it turned out, panicked and harmless, and Ruth Kestrel, watching from the rocks at the third stand because the light had finally gone the way she needed, saw him raise his arc rifle toward the Hendricks kitchen window where 2 small children stood pressed against the glass. Watching the same dog. She did not have a clean angle on his shoulder joint from here. She had a clean angle on nothing but his chest, square through the plate, no clever trick of engineering, just distance and stillness, and 13 years of her grandfather standing behind her on cold mornings saying, breathe out, hold, squeeze, don't jerk it. A rifle doesn't care how much you want the shot. It only cares if you're still. She was still. The round took him through the sternum, and he went down in the grass without a sound the dog even noticed. And Ruth lay in the rocks afterward with her heart slamming in her hands, for the first time all day, shaking hard enough that she had to set the rifle down and breathe through it before she could move. And she did not let herself think about his face, whatever it had looked like under the visor, whatever age he might have been in, whatever years his people counted them in. She thought instead about the window, about the two small shapes still pressed against the glass safe, and she made herself get up and move to the fourth stand before the light finished dying. She had 9 rounds left. It was the first time in 3 days she had killed someone who had not been about to hurt her directly, and she carried that weight all the way back to the cellar that night, where Silas held her hand while she shook and did not tell her it would get easier, because he had never lied to her about anything that mattered. "You did right," was all he said. "That's not the same as it being easy. Don't ever let it be easy." Tam, from his blanket nest in the corner, asked in a small voice if the aliens were going to leave now, and neither of them answered him, because neither of them believed it yet. That same night, while Ruth lay against the cellar wall with the rifle stock still warm from her own hands, and did not sleep so much as drift in and out of a watchfulness that never fully let go, the rest of Bell's Crossing held its own reckoning by lamplight in the Grange Hall, because 41 people cannot spend a day listening to gunfire roll down off the ridge without needing, eventually, to say something to each other about it out loud. Ellen Hendricks stood at the front with her 2 children asleep against her skirts and told the room plainly what she had seen through her own kitchen window: a trooper's rifle rising toward the glass where her son and daughter stood, and then the trooper falling before he could fire it, and no mistaking which of those 2 things had saved her children's lives. Not everyone in the room found that as simple a mathematics as she did. "I'm not saying she was wrong to do it," said Del Ashworth, who ran the feed store and had lost his own boy to a harvest accident 11 years back and had grown since into a man who weighed every remaining thing he had left against the cost of losing it. "I'm saying 4 dead aliens is 4 reasons for the rest of them to burn this whole valley down to the foundation stones, and I'd like someone in this room to explain to me why we're all supposed to sit here and let one girl decide that trade for the other 40 of us." "Because the trade was already made the day they landed in our wheat," Ellen said. "She didn't start this, Del. She's the only reason any of us are still standing here arguing about it. That won't matter to them if they decide to answer it from orbit." No one had an answer to that, because no one could promise him it wouldn't, and the silence that followed had teeth in it that the lamplight didn't soften. It was the widow Corliss, 81 years old and the last person left in the valley who remembered the actual war and not just her husband's stories about it, who finally stood, slow and stiff, and said the thing that ended the argument, if not the fear underneath it. "I watched the compact ships take my father's service rifle at the surrender line when I was 9 years old," she said. "Watched them melt it down not 30 feet from where I was standing. My father crying without making a sound because a man of his generation didn't cry where anyone could see it. And I have spent 72 years since then being told, by treaty and by habit, and by the simple exhaustion of losing, that we gave that fight up for good, and there was nothing left to do about it but keep our heads down and be grateful they let us keep the wheat. I am not going to stand in this hall at my age and tell a 17-year-old girl who is doing, alone on that ridge, more than every grown man and woman in this valley has managed to do in 30 years of quiet obedience, that she ought to stop because it frightens us. It frightens me too, Del. I would still rather die frightened and standing than old and grateful. Ruth Kestrel is not spending anyone's life but the one she's already decided to spend. The rest of you can decide for yourselves what you're willing to spend, but I'll ask you to decide it without her name in your mouth as an excuse." Nobody voted, because there was nothing to vote on that any of them had the standing to change. Ruth was on the ridge whether the Grange Hall approved of it or not, and every soul in the room understood that as clearly as they understood their own names. But something in the room settled after the widow Corliss sat back down, and by the time the lamps were carried home to darken houses, no one in Bell's Crossing spoke again of doing anything but waiting and hoping, and in the case of 3 families who had not owned a working firearm in a generation, quietly oiling whatever fencing hatchets and hunting knives they still had, not because any of them believed it would matter against arc rifles and war striders, but because it felt, after that night, unbearable to have nothing at all in their hands. Del Ashworth did not speak against Ruth again. 2 mornings later, unasked, he left a sack of his own hoarded rifle powder on the Kestrel's porch before dawn, with no note, because some apologies were easier made in silence than out loud, and Silas found it when Tam carried the morning water down and understood exactly what it meant without needing it explained. Aboard the flotilla's command deck 2 hours later, Threa Vantiss stood over a tactical display showing 3 dead troopers and a 4th wounded badly enough to be shipped back to the surgical bay, and listened to Warrant Ossex argue, not without reason, for an orbital sterilization pass over the tree line and the low ridge behind it. "We are authorized under Article 9 for exactly this contingency," Ossex said. "Organized resistance with lethal capability against reclamation personnel. 1 pass, targeted, minimal collateral to the settlement itself. We remove the threat entirely and finish the harvest on schedule." "Article 9 requires confirmed organized resistance," Vantiss said. "Confirmed. Not assumed. 4 casualties in 1 day is confirmation, Commander. 4 casualties from 1 unlocated shooter using a weapon our own tactical database lists as extinct is not organized resistance. Ossex, it is a single individual we have not yet caught, and if I call in an orbital strike over an inhabited settlement on the strength of a bruised ego, I will be the one explaining it to the Accord Compliance Board, not you." She looked back at the display, at the pattern of the 4 strikes, each one a different position, each one a clean kill or near kill on the first shot, no wasted rounds, no panic fire. Whoever this was did not fight like someone who was afraid of dying. They fought like someone who had already decided what dying would be worth. "Bring me everything the archive has on pre-compact human combustion weapons, and get Meyerth to build me a profile of who on that ridge could possibly still know how to use one. I want to understand what I'm fighting before I decide how hard to hit it." Ossex did not let it go easily. "The Compliance Board will not accept 4 dead soldiers and a stalled quota as due diligence, Commander. They will send someone to ask why you did not act sooner, and that someone will not care how carefully you read Article 9. "Then let them send someone," Vantiss said. "I would rather explain patience to a bureaucrat than explain a burned settlement to my own conscience, and those are the only 2 outcomes I can see from here. There is a 3rd outcome. You could be wrong about her being alone." Vantiss considered that, because it was, of everything Ossex had said, the one objection she could not immediately dismiss. If there is an organized resistance cell on this world that has kept a working combustion doctrine alive for 30 years under an active treaty ban, hidden well enough that neither our scans nor the Accord's own compliance audits ever found a trace of it, then Ossex, we have a considerably larger problem than 1 shooter on 1 ridge, and an orbital strike on 41 farmers will not solve it either way. It will simply make certain we never learn the truth before the rest of this species learns it can be done." She turned back to the display, to the pattern of 4 strikes that still did not read, to her eye, like anything but a single frightened, furious, extraordinarily disciplined individual doing everything possible to protect a small number of specific people. "Get me that profile, Ossex. I want a name before the Compliance Board sends me a director instead of a question." She would have her name within 2 days. She would not have nearly enough time to decide, before the Compliance Board's own director arrived to decide it for her, whether knowing it changed anything at all. For 2 more days the reclamation teams tried to find out the ordinary way, and for 2 more days Ruth Kestrel taught them, in the only language available to her, that the ordinary way would not work. They brought thermal-baffled cloaks and swept the ridge in staggered lines, and she let 3 patrols pass within 40 meters of the 4th stand without firing, patient in a way that made Silas, listening on the radio from the cellar, laugh once, low and pained and proud, and say she'd finally learned the hardest lesson he had to teach her, that the best shot was very often the one you didn't take. They flew scout drones low over the tree line with acoustic sensors tuned to catch a heartbeat at range, and she wrapped herself in a wet burlap sheet against the cold ground and slowed her breathing until the drones drifted past unsatisfied. They put counter-snipers of their own on the ridge opposite, arc rifles with magnified optics scanning for muzzle flash, and on the second afternoon, one of them came close enough that a bolt of superheated plasma cracked the granite 18 inches from where Ruth lay, close enough that grit stung her cheek and her ears rang, and she did not move for 11 minutes afterward, not until the counter-sniper had shifted his attention elsewhere, convinced he'd been shooting at a trick of the light. Late on the second day, they brought something worse than soldiers. Ruth heard it before she saw it, a low huffing rhythm moving through the underbrush below the fourth stand, wrong in a way that raised the hair on her arms before her mind caught up to why. Not the mechanical whine of a drone, not the careful placed weight of a trooper's boot, but something with a heartbeat, moving fast and low and certain, nose down. A trace hound, four-legged and armor-plated at the shoulders, bred or built for exactly this, casting back and forth across her scent trail from 3 hours before with a handler jogging 20 meters behind it. She had no shot on the handler from here, and killing the animal would only tell them exactly where she was. Instead, she did what Silas had taught her the very first week he'd put her on a stand, back when the thing she was hunting only wanted to eat and not to kill her on purpose. She came down off the rocks low and slow, into the cold spill-off from the reservoir feeder creek, and walked the last 100 meters of her retreat through 8 inches of running water with the rifle held above the current. Letting the creek take everything the hound had been following and carry it somewhere the animal's nose would never find. She heard it lose the trail behind her, heard the confused double bark and the handler's low curse in a language she didn't need translated to understand, and she was already 300 meters up the far bank, dry ground under her boots again, before either of them thought to check the water. She still had 9 rounds. She had not fired one, and it felt, lying in the new stand with her wet clothes freezing stiff against her skin, like the most important shot she hadn't taken all day. On the third day, before the walker came, the 9th flotilla tried something quieter than machines, and it was, of everything Ruth faced in 5 days on the ridge, the one that came closest to teaching her what fear actually meant. Meyerth had spent the previous night doing what Vantiss had asked of her, not just archive research into the weapon, but a personnel search through the flotilla's own manifest for anyone who might match what the ridge was demonstrating, and had found 3 decks down in a cryoberth reserved for specialists rarely needed on a routine reclamation run. A Skarn named Karsh Ilvain who held a discipline rating the rest of the flotilla did not. One earned in the internal security campaigns fought 2 centuries before the Larkspur Accord against Skarn separatist cells, who had themselves once understood the value of staying still. He did not wear plate the way the troopers did. He wore a suit the color of wet stone, sewn with 100 small tabs of local grass and bark that Meyerth's team had gathered from the tree line itself, and he carried no arc rifle, only a long-barreled rail weapon tuned for a single silent shot at extreme range. And when Vantiss briefed him, she found, for the first time since the ships had landed, someone who did not look surprised by anything she told him. "You want me to outweight her," Ilvain said. "It was not a question." "I want to know if it can be done," Vantiss said. "I am not ordering you to kill her if it comes to a shot at all. I am ordering you to find her position and hold it under observation until we understand whether what she is doing can be matched by trained discipline, or whether it is something else entirely. I have 4 dead soldiers who would like to know the difference." Ilvain went up into the tree line before dawn on the 3rd day, alone, and found a hide 200 meters from the 4th stand with a sightline down the dry wash Ruth had used twice already, and settled into it, the way Meyerth's archive had described, breath slowed, body angled to shed heat rather than trap it. Every muscle group cycled through microscopic tension and release, in a rotation designed to prevent the cramping that betrayed lesser soldiers after the first hour. He was, by every measure his own species had ever developed, extraordinarily good at being still. Ruth found him first anyway, though it took her most of the morning to be sure, because he made almost no mistakes at all. A stillness so total that she nearly walked her sightline across him twice without her eye catching anything to snag on. What gave him away in the end was not motion but its opposite, a patch of tree line that stayed exactly, mathematically the same shade of shadow through 2 hours of shifting morning light, when every other patch of shadow on that slope had crept and thinned and darkened the way shadows actually do. Silas, decades removed from any war but not from the eye it had built in him, had taught her that lesson on a cold October morning hunting elk that had gone still too long in one spot. Nothing alive holds a shadow perfectly, because nothing alive is perfectly inert, not even something trying very hard to be. She did not fire. She had, if she was reading the hide correctly, no clean angle through the brush that wouldn't require exposing herself for the half-second it took to find one, and a targetless shot at a 200-meter guess was exactly the kind of thing Silas had spent 13 years training out of her. So instead she did the only thing that cost her nothing and might cost him everything. She stayed exactly where she was, in a shallow scrape behind a fallen log at the fifth stand, and waited to see which of them the day would break first. It was, she would tell Silas afterward, the longest 6 hours of her life, longer even than the 6 hours before the ships came down, because this time she knew with total certainty that something patient and dangerous was watching the same ground she was, and that the only weapon either of them had left to use against the other was time itself. The rain came at midday, cold and steady out of a gray sky that had been building since dawn, and it was the rain, more than anything else, that decided it. Ruth had grown up in that rain, had spent childhood summers soaked through in the reservoir creek, and understood in her bones how to let cold water run off a body instead of settle into it, how to breathe slow and shallow so the shivering never quite started, how to let her core temperature drop by careful, controlled degrees rather than fight it and burn through the reserve of warmth faster. Karsh Ilvain's people had evolved under a hotter sun on a hotter world, and while his suit's thermal lining fought the cold for the first 2 hours, past the third his body began. By tiny degrees no monitoring officer aboard the flotilla would have caught in time to lose the fight, a faint tremor in the muscles of his weapon hand that his discipline could suppress from becoming visible shaking, but not, in the end, from costing him heat with every suppression. A vicious cycle his training had never been built to survive, because his training had never been tested against 6 straight hours of cold mountain rain. Ruth watched the patch of unnaturally consistent shadow finally move, very slightly, at the 4-hour mark. Not a mistake so much as the smallest possible adjustment a freezing body makes without permission, a resettling of weight from one hip to the other that any human hunter would have recognized instantly, and any Skarn commander watching the feed later would take 4 full seconds to understand for what it was. She still did not fire. She only noted it, filed it the way Silas had taught her to file everything, and kept waiting, because a wounded position was not the same as an abandoned one, and she had 9 rounds and a whole life ahead of her that depended on not wasting a single one of them on pride. At the 5-hour mark, with the rain still falling and the light beginning its long gray slide toward evening, Karsh Ilvain did something his own service record would later describe, in flat clinical language, as a tactical withdrawal necessitated by deteriorating operational conditions, and which Ruth, watching from 200 meters away with her heart finally starting to slow, understood in far simpler terms. He moved. Not far, not carelessly, a controlled low crawl back off the ridge crown toward the extraction point his handler had prepped for exactly this contingency. But it was motion, The one thing 6 hours of perfect stillness had been built to prevent. And once it started, it could not be unstarted, because a body that has begun shivering in earnest does not simply decide to stop. She let him go. She had no angle worth the round, and no reason to spend one proving a point to a man who was already, in the only way that mattered, proven wrong. Aboard the flotilla an hour later, Vantiss watched the retrieval team bring Ilvain in, half frozen and furious with himself, in a way that had nothing to do with fear, and everything to do with a discipline he had believed, until that morning, could not be outmatched by anything this species had left to throw at him. She never fired, he told Vantiss, teeth still chattering faintly under the warming blanket the medics had wrapped him in. I gave her 3 separate openings in the last hour alone, Commander, movements I could not have suppressed no matter how hard I tried, and she did not take a single one of them. She was not waiting for a better shot. She was waiting for me to lose. And I did. You held 6 hours in freezing rain against a discipline that world has apparently been building into its children for longer than either of us has been alive, Vantiss said, and there was no mockery in it. Only the same unsettled weight that had been gathering in her chest since the first trooper's ward mesh had failed under a round no sensor could explain. That is not a failure, Ilvain. That is a data point. I asked whether it could be matched by trained discipline. You have just told me, at some cost to yourself, that it cannot, not by any discipline built for a world that never made its soldiers sit still in the cold and mean it. She did not send another specialist after that. She sent instead for the walker. That same afternoon, having run out of patient options, Vantiss ordered down the one asset she had been holding back because she did not want to admit, even to herself, that 4 dead troopers, a lost tracehound trail, and a specialist's failure meant she needed it. The Warstrider came down on repulsors in the flattened wheat an hour before dusk, 3 times the height of a standing trooper, a hunched bipedal frame of layered plate and articulated joints built to walk through structure fire and keep firing. Its own ward mesh generator a full order of magnitude stronger than anything a single soldier carried. It moved into the tree line with a deliberate, unhurried gait, sweeping ground radar across every fold in the terrain, and Ruth watched it come from the 4th stand with her mouth dry, and her heart going harder than it had since the first morning. "Grandpa," she said into the radio, "there's a walker, big one, coming through the tree line toward the ridge." Silas was quiet for a moment, and when he spoke his voice had the particular steadiness she'd learned meant he was thinking hard and fast through pain. "Describe it to me." "Every joint you can see." She described it. The heavy plate across the chest and shoulders, the thick armored collar where the head unit sat, the legs built from overlapping segments that flexed at hip and knee like something built to survive exactly the kind of fire she could throw at it. "Knee joint," Silas said. "Every walker I ever saw pictures of from the war had the same weakness. Doesn't matter whose side built it, you can armor a joint against a straight hit. But you can't armor it against a hit at the right angle without losing the range of motion that makes it a walker instead of a statue. Wait for it to take a step toward you. There's a half-second window where the plate gaps at the back of the knee to let the leg bend. That's not shielded the same as the front. Hit it there and you'll drop the whole leg. That's a small window, Grandpa. It's the only one you've got. You want the truth, Ruthie. Take the first shot to find your range. You won't hit clean on a target you've never fired at before, not at this distance, not on a machine this big. Let it think it dodged luck. Then take the second shot for real." She did exactly that. The first round took the walker high on the shoulder plate as it turned, a testing shot that threw sparks and did nothing, but confirmed the range and the drop of the round at 430 meters, and the machine staggered half a step and swept its ground radar toward the muzzle flash, and for one long breath Ruth thought she had just told it exactly where she was standing. Then it took its next step forward, weight shifting onto the trailing leg, and for the half-second window her grandfather had promised her, the plate at the back of its knee joint opened like a mouth. The second round went through it clean. The walker's leg buckled sideways in a spray of hydraulic fluid and sparking servo housing, and the whole towering mass of it went down through the underbrush with a crash that rolled across the valley and set every bird within a mile into the air at once, and it did not get back up. Somewhere inside it, an alarm was screaming in a language Ruth didn't understand and didn't need to, and she was already moving, already 3 positions gone by the time the ground team reached the wreck. She had 7 rounds left, and for the first time since the ships landed, lying in the new stand with her chest heaving and her hands finally, blessedly steady, she let herself believe, just for a moment, that this might actually be winnable. Aboard the command deck, Vantiss watched the walker's telemetry die on the display and said nothing for a long time. "That was not luck," Osix said, quieter now than he had been in days. "That joint gap exists on every Strider platform we field. It has always existed. No one has ever needed to know it because no one has ever had a weapon slow enough, precise enough, and patient enough to wait for exactly the half-second it opens." "Someone taught her to know it anyway," Vantiss said. "Someone who fought a war with machines built the same way once, a long time before the Larkspur Accord ever existed." She turned from the display, and there was something new in the set of her shoulders, something that had stopped being simple professional concern and had begun, against every instinct her career had built into her, to look like grudging awe. "Pull the Striders back. I'm not feeding her another one until I understand what I am actually facing." She would not have long to wait. On the third day's end, with the walker still smoking in the underbrush, the harvester drones came for the grain silo, low and businesslike, extending intake vanes toward the community's entire winter store of wheat, moving in a wide, loose formation this time, spread far enough apart that no single shot could take more than one. Ruth watched them from the 5th stand and understood immediately that this was no longer about killing troopers or machines one at a time. This was the Reclamation Fleet demonstrating, with brutal patience of its own, that it did not need to find her to win. It only needed to take what the settlement could not live without and wait for hunger to do the rest. She had 7 rounds left, and drones were not armored the way troopers were, and she spent one of them within a heartbeat, the round punching clean through the lead drone's lift housing and dropping it dead into the wheat in a shower of sparks, and the rest of the swarm scattered upward and outward, climbing hard, out of any range she could hope to reach, unwilling now to risk another loss for grain that could be harvested somewhere with no one shooting back. It was not a victory. It was a delay, and she knew it, and that night in the cellar she said so to Silas, voice tight with something that was not quite despair but stood close enough to see it clearly. "I've got 6 rounds left, Grandpa. 6, and they've got I don't even know how many of those things. They'll just send them again tomorrow higher, spread out, and I can't stop all of them. And then what do we eat this winter even if they leave?" Silas was quiet for a while, propped against the cellar wall with a blanket over his ruined side, his face gray in the lamp light but his eyes clear. Tam had finally fallen asleep against his good shoulder. "When I was younger than you are now," he said, "my grandfather taught me to hunt elk on the high pasture with this same rifle, and he told me something I didn't understand until I was a lot older and had buried a few more people than I wanted to. He said the rifle was never the weapon. The rifle's just iron and wood, it doesn't want anything, it doesn't decide anything. The weapon is the patience. It's knowing when not to shoot as much as when to. Any fool can pull a trigger. It takes a different kind of person to lie still for 6 hours in the cold and let the moment come to her instead of chasing it." He shifted, wincing. "You've got 6 rounds. That's not a weakness, Ruthie. That's a discipline they don't have and can't buy. They've got 1,000 drones and infinite ammunition and not one soldier down there who's ever had to make 6 rounds mean something. You have. That's still worth more than their number if you use it right. What if it isn't enough? Then it isn't, and you did everything a person could do, and nobody who matters will ever say different." He reached over with his good hand and gripped hers, hard as his strength allowed. But I don't think that's how this ends. I think somewhere up there, somebody's already starting to understand what they're up against, and it isn't the rifle scaring them. It's you." He was, though neither of them could know it that night, exactly right. Threa Vantiss had watched the silo engagement, and the walkers fall both from orbit, had seen 4 of her soldiers and 1 Strider platform lost in 3 days to a shooter with, by every count her sensors could offer, no more than a handful of rounds left to their name, and had felt the last of her certainty about this operation crack down the middle. That night, alone in her quarters with the ship's lights dimmed to running gray, she called up the archive Meyerth had assembled and read, for the first time in years, actual pre-compact human military history, not the sanitized summary the Larkspur Accord's own negotiators had produced to justify what they'd taken from this species 30 years before, but the raw record. One passage, translated flat and academic by the archive's own engine, stopped her longer than the rest. A training manual, centuries out of date by the time this world's colony ships had even launched, describing the discipline expected of a marksman assigned to hold a single position for observation and interdiction. Patience is not passive, it read. Patience is the active suppression of every instinct that tells the body to move, to seek comfort, to end the waiting. It is a discipline as demanding as any form of violence, and considerably rarer. A soldier who has mastered it can be more dangerous standing still than an entire company advancing at speed, because the enemy cannot fight what it cannot find, and cannot find what refuses, hour after hour, to give itself away. She read it twice, and thought of the girl lying motionless in wet burlap, while 3 patrols searched a 50-meter radius around her and found nothing, and understood, with a clarity that unsettled her more than any of the losses had, that the 9th Flotilla was not fighting a weapon 1,000 years out of date. It was fighting a discipline the Compact itself had never developed, because the Compact had never needed to. Every conflict it had fought in 11 centuries had been settled by whichever side could bring more firepower faster, and it had never once faced an opponent who understood that patience, applied correctly, made firepower almost irrelevant. She thought, too, of Karsh Ilving, who had failed that same day at the one thing his entire service record said he could not fail at, and who had described his failure not as an accident of cold and rain, but as a defeat handed to him, deliberately and without malice, by someone who had simply wanted the outcome more, for longer than he had. The Compact had built its entire military doctrine, across 11 centuries and 100 campaigns, on the assumption that patience was a resource like any other, trainable, quantifiable, eventually exhaustible under enough pressure, applied correctly. Ruth Kestrel's patience did not behave like a resource. It behaved like a debt already paid in full 111 years before she was born, passed down hand to hand through however many quiet mornings her family had spent teaching each other to be still, until by the time it reached her it was not something she drew down and eventually ran out of. It was simply who she was. You could outarm a resource. You could outweight an exhaustible discipline, given time and pressure enough. Threa Vantiss did not yet know how, or even whether, you were meant to fight something that had stopped being a tactic 3 generations before it needed to become one. She ordered the harvester drones grounded until further notice. She did not yet order the flotilla to withdraw, but something in her had begun, quietly and against every instinct her career had built in her, to hope she would not have to finish this the way Article 9 allowed. Ossex did not share that hope, and neither, in the end, did the political officer attached to the flotilla from the Compliance Board, a cold administrator named Director Reln Ash, who arrived by shuttle on the 4th morning with a schedule to protect, and no patience left for a commander's growing reluctance. 4 dead soldiers, 1 destroyed Strider platform, 2 destroyed drones, and a harvest quota now 11 days behind projection, Ash said, standing on the command deck with his hands folded inside his sleeves, voice level in the particular way of someone accustomed to being obeyed without needing to raise it. You have identified the shooter's approximate age, approximate position, and approximate ammunition reserve, and you have chosen for 4 days running not to end this. I would like to understand why, Commander, before I file my report. Because ending it the way Article 9 allows means an orbital strike over an inhabited civilian settlement, based on the actions of one individual we have not confirmed acts on behalf of any organized resistance, Vantiss said. That is not caution, Director. That is the law we both operate under. The law exists to be applied, not admired from a distance. Ash's eyes were flat and patient, the eyes of a man for whom a burned field was simply a line item. I am authorizing the strike myself, under my own signature if yours is not available, effective at dusk tomorrow, unless the shooter is neutralized or surrendered before then. I trust that is sufficiently clear. You would burn 41 people to close an 11-day gap in a harvest quota. I would apply the law as written, Commander, which is more than I can say for you this week. Ash's gaze did not waver. You have until dusk tomorrow to produce a better outcome than the one I am authorized to provide. I would use the time wisely. To make certain his deadline was understood by more than the flotilla's own command deck, Ash ordered a shuttle to make one low pass directly over Bell's Crossing at mid-morning, running a translated broadcast on every frequency the settlement's old radios could still receive. His own voice rendered flat and toneless through the compact's translation engine and piped into 41 kitchens and barns at once. Attention, inhabitants of this settlement, the broadcast said, looping every 90 seconds for the better part of an hour while the shuttle held station 1,000 feet overhead, close enough that its shadow crossed the schoolhouse roof, and sent every dog in the valley into a fit of barking that did not stop until the shuttle finally climbed away. An individual operating from your territory has engaged compact Reclamation Fleet personnel in unlawful hostile action, resulting in multiple casualties. Under the authority of the Larkspur Accord, Article 9, failure to surrender or neutralize this individual by tomorrow evening will result in this settlement being classified as an active combatant zone, subject to remedial action at the Compliance Board's discretion. This is not a request. This is a courtesy. Silas heard it from the cellar, lying against the wall with Tam's head pressed hard into his good shoulder, and said nothing for a long moment, because there was nothing useful to say to a 10-year-old about the particular shape of the word remedial when it came from something that could burn a valley from orbit without ever setting a boot on the ground. Up in the fifth stand, Ruth heard it too, carried thin and tinny on the wind, and felt something in her chest go cold and very still in a way that had nothing to do with the discipline Silas had spent 13 years building into her. It was one thing to know in the abstract what she was risking. It was another to hear it read aloud over her own valley in a voice with no fear in it at all, patient and bureaucratic, and utterly certain of its own right to say it. She keyed the radio. "Grandpa, you heard that?" "I heard it." His voice was steady, but she had spent 5 days learning to hear the effort underneath his steadiness, and she heard it now. "That's not a soldier talking, Ruthie. Vantiss doesn't sound like that, not from what you've told me. That's someone above her, someone who's never had to look at what he's threatening. I don't like it. But I want you to hear me say something and believe it, because it's true. A man who has to broadcast a threat to 41 farmers over their own radios is a man who is worried they might not do what he wants without one. That's not strength. That's a deadline with nothing behind it yet but a signature. It's got an orbital strike behind it, Grandpa. It's got an orbital strike some officer up there hasn't actually ordered fired yet, Silas said, or he wouldn't need to spend an hour telling us he's thinking about it. Men who have already decided don't announce it. They just do it. You hold what you've been holding and let him keep talking, because every hour he spends broadcasting instead of striking is an hour that isn't dusk tomorrow yet. Below in the valley, the broadcast looped twice more before the shuttle finally banked away east and climbed out of the low cloud, and in its wake, Bell's Crossing did not panic, quite, though several families spent that afternoon quietly packing what little could be carried on foot and did not speak of why. And Ellen Hendricks stood a long time in her own doorway watching the empty sky where the shuttle had been, her children's hands in hers, and did not go inside until the light started to fail. Del Ashworth's sack of hoarded powder sat on the Kestrel's porch rail through all of it, untouched, because Ruth had not yet needed it, and would not in the end ever need it at all. But its presence there, small and stubborn and freely given, was its own answer to a broadcast that had asked, without ever quite saying so, whether this valley still believed it was worth defending. It was clear. Vantiss stood on her own command deck and felt, for the first time in 11 years, the particular cold of being overruled by someone who had never once knelt in a wheat field, and watched a 19-year-old trooper die of a wound that shouldn't have been possible. Someone who would never have to explain to anyone what a settlement of 41 people had looked like the moment before it stopped existing. She did the only thing left within her authority. She took the ground team out herself, at dusk the following evening, with orders that were her own and not the director's, not to kill the shooter, if it could possibly be avoided, but to find her, to end this the old way, soldier to soldier, before Ash's deadline made the question irrelevant. Ruth felt the change in the air before she understood it. The drones had stopped coming. The patrols that had swept the ridge for 4 days pulled back to the ships an hour before dusk, and for the first time since the ships landed, the field below Bell's Crossing sat empty and still, gold in the last light, and something about the stillness frightened her more than any of the searches had. "Grandpa," she said into the radio low, "something's different, they've pulled everyone back." "Could mean they're regrouping for something bigger," Silas said, and she could hear him trying to sit up against the pain of it, hear Tam's frightened voice asking what was happening. "Could mean orders came down from somewhere you and I can't see. Either way, don't relax, Ruthie. An enemy that goes quiet is either giving up or getting ready to hit you with everything they've got at once." It was neither, though she would not learn that until much later. It was 6 soldiers in thermal-baffled gear, moving up the tree line in absolute silence under Threa Vantiss's own direct command, using every scrap of the discipline Meyerth's archive had described, and every piece of technology the 9th Flotilla still possessed, closing on the 5th stand from 3 directions at once while the light died behind them. Ruth had 6 rounds left, and no illusions about what a 6-soldier flanking maneuver at dusk meant for someone with 6 rounds. She heard them before she saw them, not a footstep, nothing so careless, but a change in the quality of the silence itself, the particular held-breath wrongness that every hour on this ridge had taught her to trust more than her eyes. In the same instant, in the cellar below the house, Tam, without being asked, and against every instinct that told him to stay hidden in the dark, had climbed the ladder partway and pressed his eye to the gap under the storm doors, watching the tree line the way Ruth had once shown him watching for deer. And it was Tam, small and scared and determined not to be useless, who caught the first flicker of movement breaking the tree line from the north side. Well beyond the angle Ruth's last radio check had suggested she was watching. "Grandpa," he whispered, scrambling back down the ladder, "there's more of them, coming from the side by the old fence, not just the front." Silas went very still, the particular stillness Ruth had learned to recognize as him thinking fast through pain, and keyed the radio himself, voice pitched low and urgent in a way it had not been all week. "Ruthie, Tam's got eyes on movement from the north fence line. If that's true, this isn't one team coming straight at you. This is a flank, maybe 2, and I want you off that stand now, not when you're sure, because by the time you're sure it'll already be too late to matter." The warning reached her earpiece in the same half-second her own instincts finally caught up to what the wrongness in the silence had been trying to tell her. 2 signals landing together instead of one lagging behind the other, and it left no room at all for doubt. She was already moving, rolling off the stand and down through the scrub toward the old dry wash that cut behind the ridge, the one escape route she had never used because it led away from the settlement, and she had sworn to herself she would not run. A shape rose out of the brush 8 meters to her left, faster than anything wearing that much plate had any right to move, and she fired without fully raising the rifle to her shoulder. A hip shot at a range Silas would have scolded her for attempting, and it went wide of the joint she'd aimed for, taking the trooper through the forearm instead, enough to spin him but not enough to stop him. A bolt of plasma cracked past her ear close enough to blister the skin along her jaw, and she went down hard into the wash, rifle skidding from her grip. And for one long, terrible second, she thought this was where it ended, on her back in the mud with 5 rounds left in a weapon she could no longer reach. She was 17 years old, and she thought of Tam's face, and she did not scream and she did not freeze. She rolled, got a hand back on the rifle stock, and came up onto one knee with the barrel already swinging toward the nearest shape closing on her, and found herself looking directly into the visor of a soldier who had stopped 6 feet away, weapon raised, and had not fired. Threa Vantiss looked down the length of an ancient rifle held rock-steady in the hands of a girl half her own height, blood running from a graze along her jaw, mud in her hair, breathing hard and controlled even now, and did not, for a long moment, give any order at all. "Stand down," Vantiss said finally to her own team, not to Ruth, a command that landed in 5 sets of ears and froze 5 soldiers mid-motion, arc rifles half-raised, the whole ridge suddenly balanced on the thin edge of her voice. "All of you, weapons low. Now." 4 of them obeyed within the same breath, plate lowering, stances easing back from combat readiness into something closer to stillness. The 5th did not. Osix had spent 5 days watching his people die to a threat he could not see, had lost a Strider platform he had personally certified for deployment, had listened to his commander grow steadily more reluctant to end a fight he still believed could be ended cleanly, and something in him, standing 8 feet from the girl who had cost the 9th flotilla more than any single engagement in a decade, broke past whatever discipline had held him until now. He raised his arc rifle a half-degree further, finger already moving toward the trigger housing, close enough and fast enough that Vantiss's own shout of his name came a half-second too late to stop him. Ruth's rifle was already tracking. She did not aim for his chest, did not aim to kill a man who had, until that exact moment, followed every order given him. She put the round through the weapon itself, through the trigger housing and the hand wrapped around it in the same motion, and Osix went down with a scream of pain and a ruined weapon smoking in the mud instead of a hole through his heart, and the ridge went utterly, completely silent. Ruth had 4 rounds left. Her hands, for the first time in 3 days, did not shake at all. "I don't understand your language," she said, into the silence to Vantiss, because there was no one else left standing who might be in charge. "But I understand a rifle pointed at my head, and I understand what I just did to the one soldier who didn't listen to you, so however this goes, you should know I've got 4 rounds, and I mean to make every one of them count if you make me." Meyerth's voice came thin and immediate through a translation unit clipped to Vantiss's collar, rendering the words a half-second behind. Vantiss listened, and looked down at Osix curled around his ruined hand in the mud, alive, furious, humiliated, and utterly unable to argue with what had just been proven in front of the entire team. That the girl in front of her could have put that round through his throat with the same ease, and had chosen in the space of a single reflexive heartbeat, not to. Something in Vantiss's long gray face, not a human expression, nothing Ruth could read by instinct, but real all the same, settled into something that was not quite respect and not quite grief, but stood very close to both. "Tell her," Vantiss said to Meyerth, "that I believe her. Tell her I did not come to kill her tonight. Tell her I came because I wanted to see, with my own eyes, what a discipline like this looks like in the person carrying it, before someone with less patience than me decides it isn't worth understanding." The translation came through a small speaker at Meyerth's belt, flat and mechanical, but the words landed anyway. Ruth did not lower the rifle. Then, why is your director planning to burn my whole town off the map at dusk tomorrow if I'm not dead by then? Because that's what my grandfather's radio picked up off your own frequencies 2 hours ago, and I don't much care how respectful you sound if 41 people are still going to die for it. Vantiss went very still. Behind her, one of the standing soldiers shifted, and even through the visor Ruth could read the confirmation in the set of his shoulders before Vantiss spoke again. That order was given without my authorization, Vantiss said, and for the first time something like real anger sharpened the words even through the translator's flatness. And it will not stand while I command this flotilla. Pretty words for someone who was sneaking up on me with 5 soldiers 10 seconds ago. I came to end this without more dying on either side if it could be done. That has not changed. Vantiss lowered her own weapon, slowly, deliberately, and after a moment gestured for the rest of her team to do the same. You have a grandfather and, I am told, a younger sibling in that settlement. I have soldiers who followed lawful orders and died for it, 4 of them, none of whom asked to be part of whatever the compliance board decided this world was owed. Neither of us chose this fight, Kestrel. She said the name carefully, the way someone repeats an unfamiliar word they intend to remember. I would like to end it in a way that lets both of us live with how it ended. Ruth held the rifle steady a moment longer, weighing that against every hour of the last 5 days, against Tam's frightened face in the lamplight, against Silas's voice telling her the rifle was never the weapon, the discipline was. Then slowly, she let the barrel drop, though she did not set the weapon down and would not yet. Then stop your director, she said, tonight. Before dusk tomorrow means anything at all. Vantiss straightened and turned to Myrth with an order that needed no translation to land like a verdict. Get me a direct channel to Director Ash. Now. And record everything from this encounter, the archive footage, the losses, this conversation, Ossix's own conduct in it, all of it. If he wants to override my command, he can do it with the full record in front of him, not the sanitized version his aide will hand him in the morning. The channel opened 40 minutes later, Ash's cold, patient face filling the command deck's main display while Vantiss stood with the recorded footage already queued behind her. The 4 dead troopers, the fallen Strider, the 2 destroyed drones, and the girl in the mud with a century-old rifle held steady on a 6-soldier flanking team, choosing, in the one moment that mattered most, to disable rather than kill. You are proposing, Ash said, when the footage finished, that the 9th Flotilla abandon a resource recovery operation authorized under full compliance board mandate, because a single juvenile combatant has proven inconvenient to neutralize. I am proposing, Vantiss said, that we invoke the Heritage Arms exemption written into the Larkspur Accord by our own negotiators, apply it honestly for the first time in 30 years, and classify this settlement as defended territory under Article 6, which, if you read it as carefully as you read Article 9, removes it from routine harvest scheduling entirely and requires a formal reassessment before any further reclamation activity, orbital or otherwise, can proceed against it. That clause was written as a courtesy no one expected to matter. It matters now, Director, because someone finally called it, Vantiss said. And if you strike this settlement tomorrow in defiance of your own Accord's language, on the record, with this footage attached, you will not be explaining a scheduled delay to the Compliance Board. You will be explaining why the 9th Flotilla violated the treaty that ended the war in the first place, over one farming settlement's winter grain, and I do not believe that is an explanation you want to give. You would stake your record on the restraint of a species that has, by your own footage, put a hole through 5 separate pieces of compact equipment in 5 days. I would stake my record, Vantiss said, on having watched that same species choose when she had every reason and every justification to kill, not to. That is not a threat assessment, Director. That is a character reference, and I trust my own eyes on this deck more than I trust a quota sheet written by someone who has never set foot on this world. The silence on the other end of the channel stretched long enough that the soldiers behind Vantiss allowed themselves to breathe again before Ash spoke. Article 6 Reassessment, Ash said finally, flat with the particular fury of a man who has just watched a schedule and a career both bend around a variable he had refused to take seriously. Filed and logged, the strike is rescinded. But this will be noted, Vantiss, as a significant operational failure on your record, and I will be recommending exactly that to the board. Note whatever you like, Vantiss said, and closed the channel before he could answer, and stood for a moment in the sudden quiet of the command deck with something in her chest that felt, for the first time in longer than she wanted to examine, like she had done the thing she'd actually joined the fleet to do, rather than merely the thing the fleet had told her to do. Dawn came gray and cold over Bell's Crossing, and Ruth Kestrel walked down off the ridge for the first time in 5 days, rifle slung and holding 4 rounds she had not needed to fire again, and found Threa Vantiss waiting alone at the tree line, unarmed. Her escort held back at a distance that Ruth understood, without needing the translator to explain it, as a deliberate courtesy. Behind her, Ossik stood apart with his ruined hand bound in a field dressing, watching Ruth approach with an expression that had settled somewhere past anger into something closer to reluctant, unhappy respect. "The Harvest Fleet is withdrawing within the hour," Vantiss said through Meyerth's small speaker, the tactician standing a respectful few paces back. "This world is logged as defended territory under our own treaty's language. It will not come up for reassessment for at least a decade, and I intend to make certain, in whatever way remains available to me, that when it does, the assessment reflects what actually happened here rather than what the compliance board would prefer to believe happened here. And if the next commander doesn't care about the difference, then I hope," Vantiss said, "that the next generation of your people teaches its children the same discipline yours taught you. Because I have commanded soldiers for 11 years, Kestrel, across 6 worlds that never fought back, and I had begun to believe there was nothing left in this galaxy that could still surprise me. You were 5 days disproving that with a weapon my own tactical archive listed as extinct, and 4 rounds of iron my own doctrine never thought to guard against, and a patience I have not seen matched by any soldier under my own command." She paused, and something in the set of her long gray shoulders eased, just slightly, into something almost like the beginning of respect freely given rather than professionally extracted. "I do not know if that makes us allies. I do not think it makes us enemies any longer. I think it means I owe your grandfather, whoever taught him, and whoever taught them before that, an apology this fleet was never built to give." Ruth thought of Sela's in the cellar, of the rifle stock worn smooth under 3 generations of hands, of the small notches along its underside that she had never once counted out loud in front of anyone, and found, standing in the cold gray light with an alien commander offering her something that was not quite friendship and not quite surrender but real all the same, that she did not have an answer that felt big enough for any of it. So she said the only true thing she had. "He didn't teach me to kill," she said. "He taught me to be still long enough to know when I had to. There's a difference, even if your rifles can't tell it apart." Vantiss inclined her head, a gesture Meyerth's speaker did not translate because none was needed, and turned back toward the waiting shuttle, and within the hour the great gray ships lifted out of the flattened wheat and climbed into a sky the color of old iron, and did not come back. Bell's Crossing came out into the street to watch them go, all 41 of them, standing in the same spot where they had watched the scout ship burn overhead 6 days before, and this time nobody said it was probably nothing. Ellen Hendricks found Ruth at the edge of the crowd and pulled her into an embrace fierce enough to crack a rib, murmuring something into her hair that wasn't quite words, and behind her the whole street seemed to exhale at once, a sound Ruth would remember for the rest of her life, as the precise noise a community makes when it understands, altogether, that it is going to get to keep existing. Ruth walked home through the fields as the sound of the ships faded, past the wheat that would need replanting, and the fence line the young trooper had never reached, and found Silas sitting up on the cellar steps in the thin morning sun, Tam beside him wrapped in a blanket, both of them watching the sky where the ships had gone. "They're really gone," Tam said, not quite believing it. "For now," Silas said, and reached out as Ruth came up the path, and pulled her down into the kind of embrace that said everything neither of them had the words for yet. He held her a long moment, then eased back to look at her properly, the graze along her jaw, the mud, the exhaustion carved into a face that had been a child's face 6 days ago and would never quite be only that again. "4 rounds," he said finally, quiet, almost wondering. "You held 6 armed soldiers at 5 rounds, put one through a man's hand instead of his heart when you had every right to do otherwise, and made an alien commander believe you had 40. "I didn't make them believe anything," Ruth said, sitting heavily beside him on the step, the rifle across her knees, its wood warm now from her hands instead of the cold ground. "I just didn't run. That's all it ever was, wasn't it? The whole time, just not running." Silas looked at her for a long moment and then out at the wheat, and then, for the first time since the ships had come down, he smiled, small, tired, entirely real. "That," he said, "was always the whole secret. I just never had to prove it before." Ruth ran her thumb along the worn stock, over the small notches she had finally, quietly started counting. 4 rounds left in the magazine and a whole winter of replanting ahead of her, and did not answer, because there was nothing left to say that the rifle and the 5 days and the empty gray sky hadn't already said better than she could. And beside her, her grandfather's hand found her shoulder and stayed there steady, while the morning came up gold and whole over a field that, against every reasonable expectation any power in the sky above it had ever held, was still theirs. 6 weeks later, with the wheat replanted and coming up green in rows, Ruth had walked 100 times behind the old seed drill. Threa Vantiss's report reached the Compact Archive Division through channels that had nothing to do with the 9th Flotilla's official record, and everything to do with a commander who had decided, alone in her quarters the night she closed the channel on Director Ash, that some truths were worth risking a career to make permanent. It was not filed as a threat assessment, though it would eventually be read as one by every reclamation commander who came near a human settlement afterward. It was filed, in Vantiss's own words, under a classification she had to petition twice to create, because none of the Compact's existing categories had a place for it. Doctrine, unresolved. A discipline that could not be countered by force, could not be predicted by censor, and could not, in the end, be understood by anyone who had not first understood what it cost the person practicing it. Meyerth added a single line to the archive entry that Vantiss let stand exactly as written, because she could not have said it better herself. The weapon was never the rifle. The weapon was 111 years of a family refusing to forget how to be still. Ruth did not know any of that, not for months, not until a supply trader passing through on the old ground route mentioned, almost as an aside, that reclamation activity across 3 neighboring systems had slowed to a crawl that spring, commanders citing revised threat doctrine and requesting reassessment before committing ground teams to any settlement listed, however quietly, as having demonstrated what the internal memos had started calling, without much ceremony, Kestrel pattern resistance. She sat with that for a long while on the porch steps, turning it over the way she turned over most things now, slow and careful, and decided in the end that she did not much care what they called it in a compact archive 100 light-years away, so long as it meant fewer ships coming down in fewer wheat fields belonging to people who had never asked for any of this. What she cared about, that particular evening and most evenings after, was the sight of Tam at the edge of the back 40 with the rifle's empty weight balanced awkward and unfamiliar against his 10-year-old shoulder. Sila's beside him on a stool because his side still would not let him stand for long, walking him through the same lesson in the same unhurried voice he'd used on Ruth a lifetime and 6 weeks ago. No tension in the fingers, all of it in the shoulder and the breath. The rifle doesn't care how much you want the shot, it only cares if you're still. Am I doing it right? Tam asked, squinting down a barrel at nothing, at a fence post 50 feet off that would never know how carefully it was being aimed at. You're doing it exactly as wrong as your sister did the first 100 times, Silas said, and there was real warmth under the dryness of it. Which is to say you're doing it exactly right for someone who's only started. Nobody's born still, Tam. You build it one boring hour at a time, same as anything worth having. Ruth watched them from the porch with a mug of Ellen Hendrick's terrible coffee going cold in her hands, and did not go down to correct Tam's grip the 6 or 7 times she could see it needed correcting, because some lessons were not hers to give twice, and because there was something in watching her grandfather teach it a second time, patient and unhurried under a sky that had stopped, for now, holding anything more dangerous in it than weather. That felt like the actual ending of the thing the ships had started 6 weeks before, not the withdrawal, not the treaty clause, not even the silence where the broadcasts used to be, but this. An old man on a stool, a boy with a borrowed stillness he hadn't earned yet, and a rifle being handed forward instead of held alone. The notches under the stock stayed exactly as many as they'd been the morning the ships lifted off, and Ruth still didn't say the count out loud to anyone, not even herself, because some numbers were better carried in the hand than in the mouth, but she had stopped, these 6 weeks past, needing to look away from them when Tam asked to see, which felt, in its own quiet way, like its own kind of healing. She did not think, watching Tam finally settle his breathing into something almost steady under Silas's patient correction, that the hardest part of what the rifle carried was anywhere close to finished being taught. And for the first time since the dropships had come down in the wheat at first light 6 weeks before, that felt less like a burden passed on than a promise she was, for once, glad to keep.